Hey guys, tonight we begin with how the Soviet Union spied on its own citizens. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe only if you truly enjoy this kind of slow, calming storytelling. Your support means the world and helps me keep creating peaceful spaces like this one. Tell me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how this little quiet corner of the internet brings together people from all over the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan or some soft background, and let's gently into tonight's journey together. Imagine living in a place where silence felt safer than speech, where a knock on the door in the middle of the night could mean your life was about to change forever. This was the world of the Soviet Union, a vast empire that prided itself on unity and loyalty, yet quietly thrived on fear. Every whisper, every letter, every movement was watched, analyzed, and filed away. Not by enemies from outside, but by your own neighbors, colleagues, and sometimes even your family. From the outside, Soviet cities looked disciplined and orderly. Posters of smiling workers and proud soldiers covered the walls, proclaiming that socialism was strong and just. But behind that bright red curtain, another system operated. One that reached into every apartment, every school, every factory. A system built on observation, secrecy, and suspicion. It wasn't simply that the government wanted to protect itself. It was that it needed to control what people thought. And to do that, it needed to see and hear everything. The organization responsible for this was the KGB, the Committee for State Security. To outsiders, it sounded like a distant, shadowy institution. But to Soviet citizens, it was an everyday presence. It existed not just in government offices, but in conversations, in friendships, in the way people looked over their shoulders before speaking. The KGB didn't always need to use force. More often, it relied on fear, the quiet, constant knowledge that someone might be listening. To understand how this worked, you need to imagine daily life in the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Most people lived in cramped, shared apartments called kommunalkas. Families who had never met before were suddenly made to share kitchens, bathrooms, and narrow hallways. Privacy didn't really exist. If you argued too loudly or complained about shortages, someone might overhear, and that someone might report it. Sometimes it wasn't out of loyalty to the state, but out of fear that they might be accused of not reporting it. It was a web of quiet paranoia that bound everyone together. Listening devices, or bugs, were common in government offices, hotels, and even in some private homes of those suspected of disloyalty. Telephones could be tapped, mail could be opened, and casual conversations at work could be repeated to a superior. And most disturbingly, these systems worked because ordinary people helped maintain them. Teachers, students, neighbors, they all played a part, often without fully realizing it. You could be asked quietly to keep an eye on someone at your university or workplace, to take notes about what they said, who they met, and how they felt about the government. It felt like duty, but it was also a test. The culture of surveillance went far beyond simple eavesdropping. It shaped the very way people thought. It created what many called the Soviet smile, a calm, agreeable expression that hid your real feelings. People learned to speak in half-truths, to praise leaders they privately feared, and to find ways of communicating through silence. A raised eyebrow, a slight pause, a coded joke. These became the language of survival. But this didn't start with the KGB. Its roots stretched back to the early years of the Soviet state, when Lenin's secret police, the Cheka, first began the practice of rooting out enemies of the people. The idea was simple. Loyalty had to be absolute. Any sign of hesitation, a letter, a joke, a friendship with someone abroad, could be seen as betrayal. By the time Stalin came to power, this system had grown into something monstrous. Millions were arrested, interrogated, or executed under suspicion of espionage, sabotage, or disloyalty. The state didn't need to prove guilt. Suspicion itself was enough. By the 1950s and 60s, things had changed on the surface. The worst purges had ended and life appeared more stable. But the surveillance never truly stopped. It simply became more refined. Instead of mass arrests, there were quiet conversations, secret files, and warnings delivered in subtle ways. A student might be told that their attitude was being observed. A worker might be asked why they hadn't attended a political meeting. And sometimes a friend would suddenly stop calling. Not because they didn't want to, but because they'd been told not to. In every Soviet building, there was a commandant, a sort of caretaker who watched over the residents. They weren't always spies, but they reported what they saw. They knew who came and went, who received foreign packages, who had guests at strange hours. Even mailmen were sometimes questioned about letters sent from abroad. It wasn't that the state could see everything, it was that people believed it could, and that belief was enough to keep most citizens in line. The power of this surveillance wasn't just in the listening devices or the secret agents. It was in the way it changed the human mind. It made people cautious, quiet, and inward. They began to police themselves, to anticipate danger before it arrived. In many ways, that was the ultimate success of the Soviet system. It didn't need to catch every traitor. It only needed everyone to believe that it could. In this strange, fearful world, even love could become dangerous. Romantic relationships, friendships, family ties, all were affected by the possibility of betrayal. There were stories of wives reporting husbands, children reporting parents, all in the name of loyalty to the state. Sometimes it was done sincerely. Other times it was simply to survive. Yet despite all of this, ordinary life continued. People still laughed, told stories, and dreamed of a better future. They gathered in kitchens to share forbidden jokes, listened to foreign radio late at night, and whispered the truth only when they trusted the walls to stay quiet. In that silence, you could still find humanity, fragile, hidden, but unbroken. The Soviet system watched everything, but what it could never fully control was the private world of the human heart. If you could have walked through the corridors of a Soviet government building in the 1960s, you'd have felt the weight of secrecy in the air. The walls were thick, the offices small, and the sound of typewriters filled every hallway. Each clacking key was recording something, a name, a statement, a suspicion. Everything was catalogued, indexed, and cross-referenced in the immense archives of the KGB. To understand how the Soviet Union maintained such total control, you must understand this machine of fear. Not a metal one, but a human one. The KGB wasn't merely a police force. It was an entire ecosystem of watchers, analysts, psychologists, and informants. Some were motivated by ideology, some by ambition, others by fear. Every Soviet citizen was potentially part of it. A university professor might secretly report on their students. A janitor might be asked to note the conversations that happened in the stairwell. Even artists and writers were watched for signs of anti-Soviet sentiment. The system fed on paranoia, and in doing so, it sustained itself. Every KGB officer knew that power depended on information, and so they built networks that reached into every workplace and neighborhood. The goal wasn't only to catch criminals or spies, but to shape how people behaved. If people thought they were being watched, they were less likely to step out of line. The presence of surveillance was psychological, a kind of invisible fence that guided millions of lives. Behind closed doors, officers gathered to review their intelligence. Thick files filled with faded paper and scribbled notes were passed from one desk to another. Every file told a story: a man who borrowed a banned book, a woman who spoke too freely about the shortages of bread, a student who asked too many questions. Each note might seem small, but together they painted a portrait of a person, one that could decide their fate. These files were not always accurate. Mistakes were common. A rumor could become evidence. A careless joke could be twisted into a confession. And once you were in the system, it was almost impossible to escape it. People learned to live with this shadow over them, careful never to say too much, careful to look ordinary, to think ordinary, to be ordinary. In the Soviet Union, invisibility was safety. Yet the genius of the surveillance state was that it didn't have to rely only on fear. It used trust as well. Some citizens believed deeply in the communist cause. They saw themselves as guardians of the revolution, helping protect the state from enemies within. They volunteered as informants, convinced they were doing something noble. But others were pressured, manipulated, or blackmailed into cooperation. A student might be told that their academic future depended on their patriotic service. A worker might be reminded of their family's vulnerability, and so they complied, quietly, reluctantly. Inside the KGB, this vast network was known as the Agentura. By the 1970s, it numbered in the hundreds of thousands. They were the eyes and ears of the state, gathering whispers from every corner of Soviet life. Some worked abroad, spying on foreign diplomats. Others remained at home, blending into the crowd, listening and waiting. To the public, they were ordinary people. To the state, they were tools. What made the system especially chilling was its efficiency. A single comment overheard in a factory could trigger a chain reaction, an investigation, a report, an interrogation. Sometimes nothing came of it. Other times, a person disappeared into the machinery of the state, summoned for questioning, dismissed from their job, or quietly imprisoned. The goal wasn't always punishment. Often it was control. The message was clear: the state was everywhere, and it never forgot. Life under this constant gaze shaped entire generations. Children grew up learning what not to say, what not to ask. School lessons reinforced loyalty to the state and suspicion of outsiders. Students wrote essays praising the Communist Party and denouncing enemies of socialism. Even if they didn't believe it, they learned to perform belief. It was safer that way, and yet the system was fragile in its own way. Beneath the surface of obedience, there were cracks. People found ways to resist, quietly, creatively. They used humor as a shield, telling coded jokes about the government. They listened to forbidden Western radio broadcasts under blankets, the static whispering the sound of another world. They passed around banned books known as samizdat, copied secretly by hand or typewriter. Each act was small, but it carried weight. A reminder that even in a state built on control, the human spirit could still find space to breathe. One of the most haunting parts of Soviet surveillance was how it blurred the line between public and private. There was no clear boundary. Even letters to family abroad were read and censored. Diaries could be confiscated during routine searches. Travelers returning from other countries were questioned about what they'd seen and whom they'd spoken to. The act of remembering itself became dangerous because memory was a kind of resistance. To remember a freer time or a forbidden truth was to carry something the state could not erase. The KGB also used surveillance to control culture. Artists, musicians, and filmmakers were closely monitored. Their work had to pass through censors who decided what was acceptable. Anything too dark, too Western, or too individualistic was rejected. But some artists found ways to hide meaning beneath the surface. A line of poetry, a symbol in a painting, a melody that spoke to longing or loss. Those who understood could feel the truth hidden inside the art, like a pulse beneath the skin of conformity. The result was a strange dual existence. On the surface, the Soviet Union appeared united, powerful, and loyal. Beneath it, millions of private thoughts moved like a silent current, flowing unseen. The system demanded obedience, but it could never erase the quiet rebellion of thought. That was the paradox of total surveillance. The more the state tried to control minds, the more it revealed how impossible that control truly was. In the end, what kept the Soviet surveillance machine running was not technology, but a belief in the danger of enemies, belief in the necessity of loyalty, belief that safety required sacrifice. It was a story the state told its people, and one they repeated until it felt true. But behind the slogans and the posters, the truth was simpler. The system survived not because it was loved, but because it was feared. As night fell over Soviet cities, lights flickered in the windows of apartment blocks. Inside, people spoke softly, their words careful, their laughter muted. Somewhere, a phone line hummed faintly, a reminder that nothing was ever truly private. But in the quiet, you could still hear the beating heart of humanity, stubborn, defiant, and unbroken. By the 1970s, the Soviet Union had perfected its system of surveillance to a level of chilling efficiency. The fear that once relied on open terror, public arrests, show trials, and executions, had evolved into something quieter, but no less powerful. It was now woven into the fabric of daily life. Every apartment building, every school, every workplace had its hidden network of watchers and whispers. To survive, people didn't just follow the rules. They learned to sense them, to read the air, to predict what might be dangerous before anyone said a word. Imagine walking through a typical Soviet apartment block in 1975. The concrete hallways echo with footsteps. The smell of boiled cabbage lingers in the air. Families live close together, separated by thin walls through which every argument, every laugh, every sigh could be overheard. Privacy was a luxury that didn't exist. Even in your own home, the state could be listening. Radios, telephones, even televisions were rumored to have hidden microphones. Whether or not it was true didn't matter. What mattered was that everyone believed it might be. The KGB didn't need to watch everyone all the time. It only needed people to believe it could. That belief alone kept society in line. It was the genius of control through suggestion. The idea that you might be seen, that you might be heard, that you might already be on file somewhere. That was enough to keep the fear alive. People adapted in subtle ways. They learned how to speak in layers, to communicate one truth on the surface and another underneath. A simple comment about the weather could mean something entirely different if spoken with the right tone or at the right time. Humor became a kind of code, dark, dangerous, and shared only among those you trusted completely. A well-timed joke could make someone a hero in private or an enemy of the state in public. In this world, trust became the most valuable currency. People weighed every word, every friendship, every visit. A misplaced comment could destroy not only your life, but your family's. Neighbors reported neighbors. Children were taught to inform their teachers if their parents said anything counter-revolutionary at home. Even love was shadowed by suspicion. Lovers whispered under blankets, afraid that even the walls might betray them. The air itself seemed to listen. Yet for all its cruelty, this system of control was not built on chaos. It was structured, deliberate, and methodical. The KGB had divisions for everything: foreign intelligence, internal security, border control, censorship, and counterintelligence. Every factory and school had an informant. Every university had a party representative. There were guidelines for what kind of behavior might be suspicious, what kind of questions were dangerous. The system rewarded those who followed the line and punished those who didn't. To rise in the Soviet Union, one had to master the art of silent obedience, but the fear went deeper than politics. It became cultural, embedded in how people thought and spoke. Soviet citizens developed what scholars later called double consciousness. On the outside, they lived as model citizens, repeating slogans, attending parades, praising the state. On the inside, they carried private thoughts, hopes, doubts, and silent rebellions. These two worlds rarely touched. To survive, people learned to separate them completely. It created a strange kind of emotional numbness. You could not afford to be too passionate, too outspoken, or too curious. The safest way to live was to blend in, to smile when expected, to stay busy and invisible. Many became experts at pretending. They clapped when others clapped, nodded when others nodded, and laughed at the right moments. all while keeping their real opinions locked away behind their eyes. The workplace was another stage for this quiet performance. Factories and offices were filled with propaganda posters showing happy workers and slogans about unity and progress. But behind the cheerful faces, resentment brewed. Equipment was old, supplies were short, and management often cared more about quotas than people. Still, complaints were dangerous. Workers learned to fix problems quietly, to share frustrations only with the few they trusted completely. Even then, a single wrong word could find its way back to the authorities. The KGB wasn't the only source of fear. The party itself was omnipresent. Membership in the Communist Party was essential for anyone hoping to build a career or travel abroad. But party membership also meant scrutiny. Your loyalty could be questioned at any time, your record examined for inconsistencies. People kept their pasts spotless. No foreign relatives, no ideologically suspicious connections, no record of religious practice. Even a trip to church as a child could be used against you decades later. Censorship added another layer to the invisible prison. Newspapers told only the official version of events. History books were rewritten to serve the state's narrative. Films, plays, and songs were filtered through committees that removed anything too emotional or individualistic. Even love stories had to serve the cause. But people weren't fools. They could read between the lines. They knew what wasn't being said, what was being erased. Silence became a language of its own, and yet in this silence, creativity survived. Some of the most powerful works of Soviet literature and art were born in defiance of censorship. Writers like Alexander Solzhenitsyn smuggled their manuscripts abroad, exposing the brutal realities of the system. Others circulated their works secretly within the country through typewritten copies passed hand to hand. The underground network, known as samizdat. Reading these texts was an act of courage, a small spark of freedom in a dark world. There was also a strange comfort in conformity. For many, the constant surveillance and strict structure provided stability. The Soviet Union promised order, equality, and security, at least on the surface. People knew where they stood. They had jobs, homes, and a sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. The price was freedom, but after decades of propaganda, many believed it was a fair exchange. The state had created not just a political system, but a mindset that freedom was dangerous and obedience was safety. Still, beneath the facade, cracks began to show. The weight of fear and secrecy took its toll. Alcoholism spread as a silent escape. Suicide rates rose. People grew weary of pretending. Some began to push back, cautiously at first, through subtle acts of defiance. A forbidden book left on a desk, a sarcastic remark whispered during a party meeting, a faint trace of Western music heard from a hidden radio. Each act was small, but together they formed a quiet rhythm of resistance. Even within the KGB, there were those who doubted. Officers saw the toll their work took on innocent lives. Some justified it as necessary for national security. Others simply obeyed to protect their families. But a few began to question the system they served. The surveillance machine, once sharp and efficient, began to rust from within. Not from rebellion, but from fatigue. People were tired of watching and being watched. By the end of the 1970s, the Soviet Union had become a nation of contradictions, a society that prized unity but was built on suspicion, that celebrated truth but punished honesty, that sought to protect its people by teaching them to fear one another. It was a delicate balance, one that could not last forever. As one KGB officer later admitted after the fall of the Soviet Union, we thought we were controlling the people. But in truth, we were prisoners of our own system. The watchers and the watched had become one, both bound by the same invisible chain. By the dawn of the 1980s, the Soviet Union had perfected not only the art of watching its own people, but also the science of watching everyone else. Espionage was no longer just a domestic tool. It had become the Soviet Union's greatest export. The KGB stretched its invisible fingers across the globe, infiltrating embassies, universities, research labs, and even living rooms in the West. Yet, beneath all this, the same machinery that spied on foreign governments was still spying on ordinary Soviet citizens at home. The system had no off switch. Everyone was part of the web. Whether they realized it or not, every Soviet diplomat, scientist, journalist, or athlete traveling abroad knew that their every step was monitored, not only by foreign intelligence, but by their own. The KGB embedded handlers within delegations, ensuring that no one defected, spoke freely, or made unauthorized contact with Westerners. Even a friendly chat in a cafe could be interpreted as a betrayal. A wrong word on a foreign trip could end a career, or worse, ensure that the traveler never left the USSR again. Inside embassies in Washington, London, and Paris, the KGB worked tirelessly to gather secrets. Military, political, scientific. Agents blended in as translators, cultural attachés, or journalists, using charm and ideology to recruit Western informants. Some were motivated by money, others by ideology, and a few simply by ego and the thrill of playing a double game. The KGB became a master at exploiting weakness. And yet, for all its global reach, the system was always watching inward too. Agents were never free from suspicion. Even spies could be spied on. Back home, Soviet citizens listened to faint, static-filled broadcasts from Western radio stations. The BBC, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe. Forbidden voices that spoke of a different world. People huddled close to the radio, volume turned low, afraid the neighbors might hear. These broadcasts carried not only news but hope, a whisper that truth still existed somewhere. But listening was dangerous. Authorities used signal jamming towers to block foreign broadcasts, and anyone caught tuning in risked interrogation. Yet still people listened. It was a small act of rebellion, a secret conversation between the individual and the forbidden. The paranoia became self-sustaining. A Soviet citizen might wonder, was my phone tapped? Was my mail opened? Did my colleague report my joke at lunch? Often the answer didn't matter. The fear itself did the work. The KGB didn't need to catch every dissident. It only needed people to police themselves. And they did, in every home and every street. For children born into this world, the system was invisible. It was simply the air they breathed. Schools taught loyalty to the party from the first grade. Textbooks glorified Lenin, Stalin, and the triumphs of socialism. Teachers encouraged children to report anti-Soviet behavior, even if it came from their own families. Some did. A careless remark at the dinner table could lead to a late-night knock on the door. Parents learned to whisper, to smile in public, to lie with practiced ease. Truth became a private thing, hidden deep inside. By the 1980s, however, cracks were showing. The Soviet economy was slowing. Shortages were common. Lines for bread and meat stretched around the block. And beneath the surface, the people were growing restless. The Iron Curtain that separated the USSR from the West wasn't just political. It was psychological. Soviet citizens could see the gap between what they were told and what they experienced. The propaganda that once inspired now rang hollow. And when belief begins to fade, even the most powerful systems begin to tremble. Inside the KGB, officers started noticing something unsettling. People were no longer afraid in the same way. They still obeyed, but the obedience felt mechanical, drained of conviction. The fear was still there, but it had become tired, like a machine running without purpose. Reports poured in about rising black market activity, underground music, and the spread of Western culture through smuggled cassette tapes and bootleg films. The Soviet youth were changing. They still lived under surveillance, but they had learned to carve out small spaces of freedom within it. In the cities, you could find teenagers listening to forbidden rock bands like Deep Purple and the Beatles, their songs copied again and again onto magnetic tapes, passed hand to hand like treasure. Young men wore denim jackets and foreign sneakers bought from the black market, tiny acts of rebellion stitched into their clothes. KGB informants reported these trends as ideological contamination, but there was no stopping it. The wall between the Soviet world and the West was beginning to crack, not from bombs or politics, but from sound, style, and curiosity. Meanwhile, the surveillance machine continued to grow more sophisticated. The KGB experimented with hidden cameras, wiretaps, and advanced recording devices, many disguised as ordinary household objects. A telephone could be a microphone. A light switch could conceal a transmitter. In government buildings, even the furniture was suspect. The level of paranoia was extraordinary. When Soviet officials visited foreign countries, teams of KGB technicians would sweep their hotel rooms for bugs, while Western intelligence did the same for theirs. The Cold War had become a global theater of listening. At the same time, the KGB waged psychological warfare abroad, spreading disinformation, forging documents, and planting fake news stories to weaken Western societies from within. They called it active measures. Some of these campaigns were surprisingly successful, shaping perceptions and sowing doubt across entire nations. But what's fascinating is that the same tactics used against enemies abroad were mirrored at home. The Soviet people were also targets of their own state's disinformation. Truth became a weapon, wielded and withheld by those in power. Inside the Soviet Union, this manipulation created a strange sense of dual reality. The official version of the world, shown in newspapers and television, was spotless and heroic. The real version, lived on the streets and whispered in kitchens, was weary and grey. People learned to live between these two versions, balancing them carefully to survive. It was like walking on thin ice. Step too far into truth, and you could fall through. Even those at the top were not immune. KGB officers themselves were monitored by internal investigators. Informants reported on informants. Loyalty was constantly tested. In a world built on mistrust, no one was ever truly safe. Careers could end overnight with a single accusation of disloyalty. Friends vanished quietly, their names erased from records, their faces removed from photographs. Everyone understood the unspoken rule: if it happened to them, don't ask why. Don't say their name. But as the 1980s marched on, a new generation was rising. One that had grown up in the shadow of the system but was no longer willing to live entirely in its darkness. They were better educated, more connected, and less afraid. They listened to Western radio, watched smuggled movies, and secretly dreamed of travel and freedom. The world outside was beginning to seep in, no matter how high the walls were built. The Soviet Union had become an empire of whispers, held together not by belief, but by inertia. And yet the surveillance machine continued to hum, recording, cataloguing, watching, not realizing that the greatest threat was not foreign spies or internal dissenters, but time itself. The longer it went on, the more fragile it became. The KGB could control what people said, but it could never control what they thought. By the late 1980s, as reformers like Mikhail Gorbachev began to speak of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, the iron grip of surveillance began to loosen. Files were opened, truths began to surface, and for the first time in decades, people dared to speak freely. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. The spell of silence was breaking. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and the Soviet Union began to crumble, the world saw the physical collapse of a superpower. But for those who had lived inside it, the real collapse was quieter. The slow, uncertain rediscovery of truth after a lifetime of lies. People began to ask questions that had been unthinkable only a few years earlier. Who had reported on whom? What had been recorded? What had been lost? In the ruins of the KGB's archives, boxes of tapes and documents revealed the lives of millions. The words they spoke, the letters they wrote, the fears they never shared. The watchers had recorded everything, but in the end, it was they who were exposed. The machine that had once known everything about everyone could not save itself from history's judgment. And as one Soviet citizen wrote in her diary after the fall of the USSR, "We were all informants in our own way, some for the state and some for fear. But now, at last, the silence has ended. We can speak, we can remember. The era of secrets was over. The files had been opened. The whispers had become voices." When a system watches everyone, it doesn't just collect information. It rewires how people think. In the Soviet Union, surveillance wasn't merely a political tool. It was a way to shape the human soul. From childhood, citizens were taught that safety came not from privacy, but from conformity. The walls might have been made of concrete and plaster, but they felt alive, listening, waiting. Over time, people stopped needing a guard in the corner. They became their own guards. Fear in this world was quiet. It was not the kind that screamed in the streets or led to open rebellion. It was a whisper in the mind that said, "Be careful." It lived in pauses, in glances, in the way people lowered their voices when speaking about anything that mattered. This subtle, constant fear was the foundation upon which the Soviet state built its control. And it was so effective because it did not always rely on violence. It relied on the imagination. A mother might remind her child not to repeat a joke their father told at dinner. A student might hesitate before answering a teacher's question, unsure which opinion was safe. A worker might hear rumors about a colleague being questioned by the KGB and quietly remove that colleague's name from their circle of friends. No one had to tell them what to do. The rules were unspoken but deeply understood. Speak carefully, trust slowly, obey silently. This was the true genius of the Soviet surveillance state. It made fear invisible. The KGB didn't have to monitor every conversation or read every letter. The knowledge that it could was enough. People began editing themselves before the censors ever touched their words. Caution became instinct, passed down like an inheritance. Children learned it before they even understood politics. In Soviet psychology, this constant vigilance created what one scholar later called the internal censor. It was a voice in the head that anticipated punishment before it ever came. You didn't need to be arrested to feel imprisoned. Even private thoughts carried weight because the state had convinced people that loyalty was measured not just by action, but by purity of belief. To doubt was to betray. To think freely was to risk everything, and yet people adapted. Humans always do. Life went on. People fell in love, raised families, and pursued small joys within the boundaries allowed. But even happiness was shaped by the system. A husband might keep a secret stash of banned books hidden behind a false wall. A wife might listen to forbidden Western music on a smuggled cassette when she was alone. A student might secretly write poetry about freedom but never dare to show it to anyone. Every act of individuality became a form of resistance, however small. Friendship too took on a strange quality. To be trusted by someone was a precious thing, but trust was never absolute. Even close friends avoided talking about politics in private. A careless comment could destroy a life. Not just yours, but theirs. People learned to speak in coded language, with subtle hints and shared glances replacing direct words. In a way, the whole nation spoke in riddles. Truth became something you had to feel rather than say. And the irony was cruel. The more people feared betrayal, the more isolated they became. The KGB didn't have to arrest everyone to destroy community. Suspicion did the work for them. Neighbors watched neighbors, workers watched co-workers, and sometimes even families watched each other. Every relationship contained a shadow. One particularly chilling part of this reality was the use of informants. By the 1970s, estimates suggest that there were millions of informants across the Soviet Union. Ordinary people recruited to report on those around them. Some were motivated by ideology, others by fear, and some simply by survival. Refusing to cooperate could bring suspicion, and suspicion could destroy you. So people cooperated. They listened. They reported. Sometimes a friend would vanish, and the reason would never be known. Maybe they were arrested. Maybe they were transferred. Maybe they had simply said the wrong thing to the wrong person. The uncertainty was deliberate. The Soviet state didn't just punish, it created confusion. It made people question their own perceptions. Who was innocent? Who was guilty? What was true? By keeping everyone unsure, it kept everyone obedient. This uncertainty even extended to art and literature. Writers, filmmakers, and musicians walked a dangerous line. They knew that a work deemed anti-Soviet could lead to censorship, exile, or imprisonment. So they learned to write in layers, to hide truth within metaphor, irony, or allegory. A poem about a bird might secretly be about freedom. A play about a king might really be about a dictator. Those who could read between the lines understood the hidden meanings, while the censors, often deliberately, pretended not to. But despite this repression, creativity thrived underground. In the shadows of fear, a quiet cultural revolution took place. Secret journals circulated among trusted friends. Paintings banned from official exhibitions found homes in private apartments. Musicians recorded songs in basements using homemade equipment. The Soviet system could control the public stage, but it could never silence the human urge to express. Art became a kind of coded defiance, a whisper that said, "We are still here." For those who worked inside the KGB, the experience was equally complex. Many agents believed they were protecting their country from enemies, both internal and external. They saw themselves as patriots, guardians of the revolution. Yet others, disillusioned, understood the darker reality, that they were watching not enemies, but their own people. Some began to question their role in the machine. A few even defected, smuggling secrets to the West in hopes of exposing the truth. But for every defector, there were hundreds who stayed, trapped by loyalty, fear, or habit. Life under constant observation changed people in subtle ways. Privacy, something most take for granted, became a luxury. People learned to keep their true thoughts locked away, deep within themselves. Marriages often carried invisible scars. Spouses sometimes discovered years later that one of them had been an informant. Even love was not immune to the reach of the state. And yet, amid all this darkness, small acts of rebellion shone brightly. A man refusing to stand for a propaganda speech. A teacher secretly giving her students a banned history book. A woman writing a letter to a relative abroad, knowing it would be opened and read. These were not grand revolutions, but they were deeply human ones. Proof that even under total control, people found ways to remain themselves. Children growing up in this environment absorbed these contradictions. They were taught to love their country and fear it at the same time. In school, they pledged loyalty to the party, recited slogans, and celebrated Soviet heroes. At home, they heard their parents whisper about shortages, corruption, and hypocrisy. This double reality shaped an entire generation, one that learned to smile in public and think privately, to act obedient while quietly yearning for truth. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, this quiet internal conflict had reached its peak. The Soviet Union seemed stable on the surface, but underneath, it was filled with silent tension. People went through the motions of daily life, working, studying, attending parades, while something deeper was eroding. Faith. The idea that the system was just, that the future was bright, that sacrifice meant progress. These beliefs were crumbling. When belief dies, even the most efficient surveillance cannot bring it back. It is easy, from the outside, to see the Soviet Union's surveillance state as merely oppressive. But for those who lived inside it, it was also strangely intimate. The state was everywhere, in schools, workplaces, media, even homes. It was both protector and predator, both family and warden. People didn't just fear it, they depended on it. And that dependence, that quiet entanglement, was what made it so powerful. To understand how the Soviet Union spied on its citizens, you must also understand how it made them complicit. It didn't just watch them, it taught them to watch themselves. The result was a society where everyone carried the state within them, like a shadow that never faded, even in the brightest light. But shadows move when the light changes, and by the 1980s that light was beginning to shift. The cracks in the system that had been forming for decades were widening. Truth, long buried, was beginning to surface in whispers, in art, in courage. The people who had learned to live in silence were beginning, tentatively, to speak. The great irony of the Soviet surveillance machine was this. In trying to control every thought, it created a nation that thought deeply. In trying to suppress truth, made people hunger for it. And in trying to destroy individuality, it inadvertently preserved it, in secret, in fear, but alive. The story of that awakening, of how people began to reclaim their voices after decades of silence, would become one of the most remarkable chapters in modern history. When the world outside became a theater of control, the real performances took place underground, in hidden rooms, behind locked doors, under layers of secrecy. The Soviet Union of the 1960s and 1970s was a nation of watchers, but it was also a nation of whisperers. Beneath the grey surface of order and obedience existed a vibrant secret culture, one that defied silence through the soft rebellion of art, love, and imagination. The state could dictate public life, but it could never fully command the private realm. It could tell citizens what to read, but not what to dream. It could censor the page, but not the mind. And so, out of the cracks in this enormous machinery of control, a quiet revolution began to grow. In a small apartment on the outskirts of Moscow, a handful of poets would gather late at night. They would whisper their verses to one another over the hum of the radiator, careful not to speak too loudly. The poems weren't about politics directly. They were about longing, loss, time, and the meaning of freedom. Every word was a risk, but that risk gave it meaning. Writing was no longer an act of expression, it was an act of defiance. Across the city, another group might be playing forbidden Western records, smuggled vinyls from the Beatles or the Rolling Stones. The soft crackle of the needle carried more than music. It carried a glimpse of another world, one filled with color and possibility. For a generation born into grey conformity, those melodies were like oxygen. Young people would gather around a single record player, close their eyes, and imagine streets without fear. This underground world had many forms. Painters used muted palettes and distorted figures to express emotions they could never name. Writers circulated samizdat, self-published manuscripts typed on carbon paper and passed hand to hand like sacred texts. Each copy could take hours to make, each distribution an act of courage. Reading them was a private rebellion. Possessing one could mean imprisonment, yet people kept them, treasured them, hid them beneath floorboards or between mattress seams. The more forbidden something was, the more it was loved. And then there were the secret libraries, private. Collections of banned works by authors like Solzhenitsyn, Nabokov, or Orwell. To hold a copy of the Gulag Archipelago was to hold truth itself, truth that had been declared illegal. In that truth, people found both pain and relief. They were not alone in their fear or doubt. Someone had dared to write what they all felt, but could never say. In the quiet of night, with a candle flickering, reading became communion, not with God, but with honesty. The KGB, of course, knew that art could be dangerous. They understood that imagination was more subversive than violence, so they kept close watch on the creative class. Painters, writers, and musicians lived under constant scrutiny. Their phones were tapped, their studios monitored, their exhibitions inspected. Many faced harassment, exile, or imprisonment. Some were labeled enemies of the people simply for refusing to conform. Yet, the state's heavy hand only gave the underground more purpose. The more it tried to silence them, the more they found ways to speak. This silent struggle gave rise to what historians later called the Second Culture, a society within a society, bound not by law, but by trust. To be part of it required courage. Every meeting carried risk, every conversation could end in betrayal. But for those within it, that danger made life feel real again. They were reclaiming something precious, the right to feel, to think, to be human. Even love in this world took on a different shape. It was quieter, more cautious, but also deeper. Lovers whispered secrets that could destroy them, shared books that could get them arrested, protected each other from suspicion. In a society where intimacy was rare, to trust someone with your truth was the greatest act of devotion. Many couples kept diaries together, coded records of their thoughts, written in symbols or invented alphabets to evade discovery. These journals were love letters to freedom. But fear always lingered at the edges. Some lovers discovered years later that one of them had been coerced into informing for the KGB. The betrayal wasn't always malicious. Sometimes it came from desperation, blackmail, or survival. The line between victim and collaborator was never clear. The Soviet system thrived on these grey zones, on making people complicit in their own oppression. Every confession made under pressure fed the illusion that control was complete. Still, the underground endured, and it wasn't just artists or intellectuals. Ordinary citizens found ways to resist through small, symbolic gestures. A grandmother keeping an icon hidden behind a curtain despite decades of atheistic propaganda. A teacher quietly telling her students the real history of the purges. A factory worker carving anti-party slogans into a bathroom stall. These acts were invisible in official reports, but they were the heartbeat of dissent. Even humor became a weapon. Soviet citizens developed an entire culture of jokes. Sharp, dark, and dangerously funny. They laughed about shortages, about propaganda, about the absurdities of bureaucracy. Jokes spread faster than any pamphlet, whispered at dinner tables or exchanged in lines for bread. Everyone knew the risk. Being caught telling one could lead to interrogation or worse. But laughter, for a few seconds, broke the spell of fear. It reminded people that the system, for all its power, was not infallible. The Soviet leadership understood this too. They feared humor more than anger because humor eroded fear. You cannot control someone who can laugh at you. So the state tried to suppress it, but like water, humor found cracks and seeped through. It was unstoppable. The most fascinating thing about this underground world was that it wasn't overtly revolutionary. Most of its participants weren't plotting coups or writing manifestos. They were simply trying to live with dignity in a world that demanded conformity. In their quiet defiance, they preserved the humanity that the system sought to erase. They didn't overthrow the Soviet Union by force, they outlasted it by memory. In cities like Leningrad and Kiev, secret art exhibits known as apartment galleries became sanctuaries for the creative spirit. People would gather in cramped living rooms, surrounded by forbidden paintings. The air smelled of cigarette smoke, varnish, and nervous excitement. Every knock on the door sent a shiver through the crowd. Yet, when the lights dimmed and someone recited a poem or played a band song, everyone in the room felt the same thing. Freedom. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was fragile, fleeting, but real. Over time, the underground began to connect with the world beyond Soviet borders. Smuggled recordings and manuscripts found their way to the West, where they inspired international movements for human rights and cultural freedom. The state, for all its surveillance, could not stop information from slipping through cracks. Truth, once written, has a way of traveling, and by the 1980s, it was moving faster than the KGB could contain. Technology, too, became part of this shift. Typewriters, tape recorders, and even primitive photocopiers allowed for wider dissemination of banned material. What once required months to share now took days. The same tools the state used for bureaucracy became instruments of resistance. With every secret copy made, every tape duplicated, the machinery of oppression was turned back on itself. But perhaps the most powerful weapon against total control was hope. A quiet, stubborn belief that someday the walls would fall. That belief lived in the hearts of millions who had never seen the West, never tasted true freedom, but somehow knew it existed. It was passed through music, through whispers, through the stories of those who had dared to speak out. Hope was contagious, and once it spread, it could not be contained. By the late 1980s, this underground culture had become a tide. It was invisible to the authorities until it was too late. When Gorbachev introduced glasnost, a policy of openness, he believed he could reform the system. What he didn't realize was that beneath the surface, the people were already ready to speak. The silence that had lasted for generations cracked open, and the words that had been buried for decades poured out. The Soviet Union, once a fortress of control, was undone not by invasion but by conversation. The same people who had whispered in kitchens began to speak openly in the streets. The underground had risen, and with it, a new kind of courage, the courage to tell the truth. The KGB still watched, but their gaze had lost its power. You cannot control people who no longer believe in their own fear. The empire built on silence was collapsing under the weight of its own secrets. And so the story of the Soviet surveillance state, of how it spied, silenced, and shaped its people, began to end not with violence, but with words. Words written in secret, shared in trust, whispered in the dark, and finally spoken aloud in daylight. The spies had built a world where no one could hide. But in the end, it was the truth that refused to stay hidden. The revolution the KGB feared most didn't come with guns or slogans. It came in poems, songs, laughter, and love. In the quiet defiance of people who, even under constant watch, never stopped being human. The greatest trick of the Soviet state wasn't in the walls it built around its citizens. It was in the ones it built inside their minds. By the 1970s, the machinery of surveillance had evolved far beyond police raids or secret microphones. It had become something quieter, more insidious. The Soviet citizen had learned to watch themselves. From the day a child was born, the state was already there. In the classroom, in the television, in the pages of every textbook. The message was simple but constant. You are part of something greater than yourself. To be Soviet was to belong, to contribute, to obey. The state wasn't just a government. It was a moral force, an identity, a faith. And faith, once internalized, needs no overseer. In Soviet schools, children were not just taught math and history. They were trained in vigilance. Posters on the wall showed cheerful pioneers reporting suspicious behavior to their teachers. If you see something unusual, the slogan read, tell an adult. The lesson was clear. Loyalty meant surveillance. Truth and virtue were measured by how well you could observe others. Even the most innocent relationships were touched by this culture of control. Teachers encouraged students to report their parents if they spoke ill of the party. Stories spread of children who had turned in their own fathers, believing they were protecting the motherland. These stories weren't myths. They were lessons. Obedience was the highest virtue. The party replaced the family. Stalin replaced the father. One of the most chilling examples came from the story of Pavlik Morozov, a real boy turned into a Soviet legend. According to the tale, Pavlik reported his own father to the authorities for hoarding grain during the early collectivization campaigns. He was later killed by relatives in revenge, but the state made him a martyr. Monuments were built in his honor. His face appeared in school books, his story recited by millions of children. The message was unmistakable. Loyalty to the state came before blood, before love, before conscience. By the time those children grew into adults, they no longer needed to be told what was allowed or forbidden. They could feel it. The boundaries of thought became self-policed. People learned to speak in codes, to say nothing that could be misunderstood. Conversations became an art of omission. Every sentence carried a shadow. Even in private, even alone, a small voice inside reminded you to be careful. Apartments too were designed with this silent vigilance in mind. Soviet housing blocks, the Khrushchevkas, were cramped, thin-walled, and uniform. Privacy was a luxury few could afford. Every cough, every argument, every whispered word could be overheard. Neighbors became both community and threat. The walls had ears, and sometimes those ears were human. Officially, there was no spying neighbor network, but informants were everywhere. Sometimes a friend, sometimes the building superintendent, sometimes your own spouse. And the terrifying thing? Most informants didn't think of themselves as traitors. The KGB didn't need to recruit millions of villains, just ordinary people who believed they were doing their duty. Some cooperated for money or protection, others out of fear. Many simply wanted to keep their jobs or ensure their children could go to university. The system didn't demand love, only compliance. And compliance, over time, became culture. This constant observation reshaped how people behaved. Even when no one was watching, citizens acted as if they were. Sociologists later called it the internalized gaze. It was a kind of psychological conditioning, a reflex to align one's behavior with the imagined expectations of authority. You learned not to stand out, not to ask questions, not to trust too easily. The safest path was silence, but silence came with a cost. Over time, it hollowed out relationships, eroded sincerity, and bred paranoia. People stopped confiding in friends, avoided emotional honesty, even within families. The Soviet home became a stage set. Smiles for the world outside, secrets buried deep within. Children grew up watching their parents' caution, absorbing it like language. Generations learned that safety meant invisibility. Workplaces were no different. Every factory, office, and collective farm had its partcom, the party committee responsible for ideological purity. They organized meetings, monitored morale, and quietly noted dissent. To rise in rank, you needed to be seen as loyal, active, enthusiastic. Attendance at political lectures wasn't optional, and neither was clapping at the right moments. Even laughter could be dangerous if it came at the wrong time. And yet, within these rigid structures, people found ways to survive. They developed an entire culture of double meanings, a kind of linguistic camouflage. Officially, they recited party slogans. Privately, they twisted them into jokes. A phrase like, "the plan has been fulfilled at 120%, might earn applause in a meeting, but in private, everyone knew it was a lie. These shared fictions became a strange form of solidarity. Everyone pretended together, and in that pretense, they found unity. Television, too, became an instrument of control. Every night, families gathered to watch the news, where presenters in impeccable suits spoke in calm, confident tones. The message was always the same: the Soviet Union is strong, the West is weak, the people are happy. Even when shelves were empty, when winters were cold and hope was thin, the television showed smiling workers and bountiful harvests. It wasn't just propaganda, it was reassurance. If the screen said everything was fine, then maybe it was. But beneath the glow of the television, another form of media thrived: the whispered rumor. In a system where official truth couldn't be trusted, the rumor became currency. People traded information like contraband. Did you hear what really happened in Chernobyl? They say Brezhnev is sick. My cousin heard there's a shortage coming. The KGB feared rumors more than any pamphlet because they spread fast and couldn't be traced. Ironically, the more the state lied, the more people relied on gossip, until even lies became a form of truth. The surveillance state didn't just create fear, it created performance. To survive, you had to play a role. The diligent worker, the proud citizen, the silent believer. Sociologists later compared it to living in a theater. The public self performed loyalty, while the private self hid behind the curtain. Everyone was an actor, and everyone knew it. But no one dared to stop the play. This constant duality left deep psychological scars. Many citizens developed what psychologists now call learned helplessness, the sense that nothing they did could change anything. The system was too big, too strong, too eternal. Hope became dangerous. Apathy became safe. It was easier to shrug than to resist. In the absence of freedom, many turned inward, focusing on small pleasures, a good meal, a family outing, a song on the radio. Life shrank to what was safe. And yet, in that shrinking, people discovered resilience. The same surveillance that sought to crush individuality inadvertently strengthened it in hidden ways. When you can't speak freely, you learn to think deeply. When you can't protest openly, you find subtle ways to say no. Acts of resistance became microscopic. A sarcastic remark, an unfinished sentence, a raised eyebrow. These gestures meant everything. They were signals between those who still remembered what freedom felt like. Even religion, though banned and mocked, persisted in secret. Grandmothers hid icons behind curtains, whispered prayers under their breath, and passed their faith to grandchildren when no one was listening. In a world stripped of transcendence, belief became another form of rebellion, not against the party, but against despair itself. The Soviet surveillance state wanted citizens to be predictable, transparent, and obedient. What it created instead was a nation of actors, poets, and code makers, people who could communicate without words, who could find meaning in silence. In trying to control every thought, the system accidentally taught millions to think differently. By the late 1980s, this invisible tension between obedience and authenticity began to crack the surface. People had lived too long pretending. They were tired of the masks, the performances, the fear. And when Gorbachev's glasnost opened the floodgates, what came out wasn't just political anger. It was decades of pent-up emotion. The laughter, the tears, the songs, all the things that had been repressed, burst into the open. Suddenly, the same streets that once echoed with party marches were filled with protest chants. The same television that once broadcast slogans now aired debates. And the same people who once whispered in kitchens now shouted in squares. The watchers had become the watched. It was the ultimate irony. The surveillance state had created the very citizens it feared most. Thoughtful, cautious, and utterly unwilling to believe in lies anymore. The KGB's eyes were still everywhere, but they no longer inspired obedience. A society that had spent generations pretending finally learned how to speak. And when the Soviet Union fell in 1991, it wasn't just a political collapse. It was a psychological one. The walls of fear that had divided hearts and minds crumbled too. For the first time in decades, the silence was gone. People could finally hear themselves think, but the echoes of that surveillance culture didn't disappear overnight. They lingered. In habits, in gestures, in the instinct to lower one's voice before saying something true. For many, freedom felt strange, even frightening. After all, when you've lived your entire life under watch, being unseen can feel like falling. By the mid-20th century, the Soviet Union had perfected not only the art of fear, but the science of listening. The KGB's surveillance network wasn't just a matter of human informants anymore. It was mechanical, methodical, and terrifyingly precise. If the people had learned to watch their words, It was because the machines were already doing it for them. In the offices of Lubyanka, the KGB headquarters in Moscow, rows of operators sat behind consoles covered in blinking lights. They weren't spies in trench coats. They were technicians, engineers, and linguists. Their mission was to monitor the hum of Soviet life, the phone calls, radio chatter, and coded signals that pulsed through the wires of the empire. Every city, every town, every building with a phone line was part of the net. A whisper in Leningrad could be captured by a receiver hundreds of kilometers away. Conversations weren't just overheard, they were catalogued, analyzed, and archived. Some phone lines were permanently tapped, not by hand, but by design. The very infrastructure of Soviet communication was built with surveillance in mind. Private phone calls were a privilege most citizens could never fully trust. The faint clicks, the slight echo, the odd pauses, everyone knew what they meant. Somewhere, someone was listening. People developed an instinct for speaking in code, replacing sensitive words with vague phrases or jokes. Instead of party criticism, they might say the weather. Instead of police, they'd say the guests. The language of fear was always indirect. In government buildings, microphones were hidden in walls, chandeliers, and furniture. Even the Kremlin wasn't safe. In 1945, the Americans presented the Soviet ambassador with a wooden carving of the Great Seal of the United States as a gesture of friendship. It hung proudly in his Moscow office for years, until 1952, when technicians discovered it contained a listening device with no batteries, no wires, and no transmitter in the traditional sense. It was powered by radio waves, the marvel of espionage engineering, created by a young Soviet inventor named Leon Terema. The Soviets were impressed. They studied it, replicated it, and improved upon it. Soon, they had their own versions, hidden not in gifts, but in walls across the USSR hotels for foreigners, such as the luxurious Hotel Metropole in Moscow or the Rossiya Hotel near the Kremlin, were riddled with hidden cameras and microphones. The state didn't just spy on its own people, it spied on its guests. Western diplomats, journalists, and tourists were all fair game. Their rooms were bugged, their movements tracked, and their conversations recorded. KGB agents were trained to retrieve audio reels every morning, label them with dates and times, and deliver them for transcription. But the most invasive technology wasn't always electronic. Sometimes it was biological. The KGB pioneered psychological profiling techniques that made fear an exact science. Every suspect had a Dello, a file filled with not only their actions, but their habits, fears, and family connections. The KGB didn't just want to know what you did, it wanted to know what you might do. To think wrongly was almost as dangerous as to act wrongly. This kind of predictive control created a nation of self-censors. Writers, for example, didn't wait for censorship to strike. They did it themselves. Before submitting manuscripts, they trimmed paragraphs, altered metaphors, softened critiques. They became their own editors, their own prison guards. The greatest writers of the Soviet era, Solzhenitsyn, Bulgakov, Pasternak, all faced this paradox: how to tell the truth in a world that punished honesty. And yet, even as they were watched, they watched back. Writers developed layers of meaning so subtle that even censors sometimes missed them. In coded fiction, satire, and allegory, they buried rebellion beneath symbolism. A story about a farmer's stubborn cow might, to the alert reader, be about the futility of the 5-year plan. A poem about snow might really be about silence. The human spirit, even under surveillance, found ways to whisper. Meanwhile, the KGB kept expanding its technological reach. In the 1970s, it began experimenting with mass data collection, recording not only conversations, but movement. Surveillance vans equipped with directional microphones could park on any street and capture sound from several floors up. In public buildings, officers monitored electrical fluctuations to detect unauthorized radio transmitters. Even letters weren't safe. Every major post office had a censorship office disguised as a special department. Workers there used steam, chemicals, and heat to open and reseal envelopes without detection. They photographed each page and added copies to archives. Foreign mail was particularly prized. Anything from the West, a letter, a newspaper clipping, even a candy wrapper, was evidence of ideological contamination. Radio, once a window to the outside world, became another battlefield. Shortwave broadcasts from the BBC, Voice of America, and Radio Free Europe carried forbidden news and Western music. To counter this, the Soviet state built enormous jamming towers that filled the air with white noise and static. Whole neighborhoods would buzz with interference. Still, millions of listeners tuned in late at night, adjusting dials in secret, straining to catch a phrase from across the Iron Curtain. The forbidden songs of the Beatles or Queen became whispered acts of rebellion, proof that another world existed. There was even a rumor that certain factories were designed with acoustics that made conversations travel upward, toward ceiling microphones. Whether or not it was true didn't matter. What mattered was that people believed it. The belief itself was control. In the Soviet Union, rumor often did the work of truth. This omnipresent sense of being observed had profound effects on how people experienced reality. Sociologists later noted that Soviet citizens developed what they called dual perception. There was official truth, the party line, the slogans, the heroic statistics, an unofficial truth, the quiet understanding shared among ordinary people that none of it was real. These two realities coexisted like parallel worlds, and to survive, one had to navigate both. At the center of it all stood the KGB, the ultimate symbol of omniscience. To most Soviets, it was not an agency but an idea, vast, faceless, all-knowing. In truth, the KGB had fewer agents than most people imagined, but its strength lay in that very illusion. When everyone thinks they're being watched, no one dares to act. And yet, within the KGB, there were those who began to question the very machine they had helped build. Some officers, reading report after report, listening to the same frightened voices, started to feel unease. They saw the contradictions, the paranoia that stifled innovation, the fear that bred stagnation. They realized that by turning the entire population into suspects, the state had made trust impossible. A society without trust cannot progress. This internal doubt grew quietly in the shadows. When reformers like Gorbachev rose to power, promising glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, they were speaking not just to the people, but to the watchers themselves. Even within the KGB, some had grown weary of listening. Still, the tools of control didn't vanish. As late as the 1980s, the Soviet Union continued to develop advanced eavesdropping technologies. Laser microphones that could pick up conversations from vibrating windows, miniature recorders hidden in pens, and cameras disguised as buttons. It was surveillance refined to an art form, elegant, invisible, and deeply human in its obsession with control. And yet, for all its sophistication, the machine was collapsing under its own weight. The cost of monitoring millions was immense, and the information it gathered was often useless. Millions of hours of small talk, trivial complaints, and empty loyalty. The system could record everything, but it could understand nothing. By the end of the decade, the illusion of omnipotence had begun to crack. The Berlin Wall fell. Protests erupted. The Watchers, who had spent decades mastering silence, now faced a population learning how to speak. The microphones were still there, the cameras still hidden, but suddenly they seemed powerless, because once people stop whispering and start shouting, even the best machines can't keep up. When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, KGB archives revealed the sheer scale of the operation. Millions of files, endless reels of tape, and entire warehouses filled with confiscated letters. It was a monument to control, and at the same time, a graveyard of voices. Every one of those documents represented a life lived under watch, a laugh not shared, a thought not spoken, a truth delayed. But among the ruins, something remarkable remained, a resilience that surveillance had failed to erase. The people who had been watched for generations had learned something profound, that freedom isn't given, it's reclaimed. They had lived through the age of listening machines. Now for the first time, the world was listening to them. By the late 1950s, the Soviet Union had entered what historians often call the age of quiet control. The show trials and mass purges of Stalin's era were mostly over, but the machinery of fear remained very much alive. It had simply become quieter, more subtle, and more deeply woven into the fabric of everyday life. The loud crack of midnight arrests was replaced by a softer, more insidious sound, the hum of surveillance that never truly stopped. For the average Soviet citizen, control wasn't enforced with open violence anymore. It was psychological, cultural, and social, a web of expectations that dictated how to speak, dress, work, and even dream. The streets looked calm, the cities industrious, the people obedient. But beneath that surface was a silent calculation everyone made daily, what to say and what to conceal. In Moscow's crowded apartments known as communalkas, privacy was almost impossible. Families shared kitchens, bathrooms, and sometimes even walls so thin that conversations could be overheard through plaster. If you wanted to complain about the government, you didn't whisper it indoors. You went for a walk, preferably in a park or by a river, where the wind might carry your words away before anyone could record them. People learned to read lips, to gesture, to convey ideas through glances and silence. It was an entire unspoken language of survival. Even children weren't free from the system. From an early age, Soviet students were taught that loyalty to the party was the highest virtue. Schools encouraged students to report parents who spoke incorrectly about the state. It wasn't unusual for a teacher to quietly ask, "What did your father say about the new 5-year plan?" Children, eager to please, might repeat what they'd overheard at the dinner table, and a careless remark could lead to a visit from the authorities. Parents, in turn, learned to teach their children two truths, the public truth and the private truth. One was for school and one was for home. At the same time, propaganda surrounded every aspect of life. Billboards showed smiling workers holding banners of progress. Films depicted the Soviet citizen as heroic, tireless, and loyal. Newspapers printed stories of triumph in agriculture, space, and industry, even when factories were failing and harvests were poor. To live in the Soviet Union was to live in a world where the narrative was written for you and believing it wasn't as important as pretending to. This pretended belief created what psychologists later called the mask of loyalty. People learned to wear it in offices, factories, and public meetings. During party gatherings, applause could last for minutes. Not because people were genuinely inspired, but because no one wanted to be the first to stop clapping. There's an old Soviet joke. At every meeting, everyone claps until their hands hurt, because the man who stops first is the one who gets arrested. Behind that humor was a chilling truth. Workplaces, too, were instruments of control. The state was not just your employer. It was your provider, your judge, and your potential executioner. Every worker had a file that recorded not just their performance, but their political reliability. A single bad remark could end a career. Advancement didn't always depend on skill, but on loyalty. Those who joined the Communist Party, attended rallies, and quoted Lenin were promoted. Those who didn't were quietly sidelined. In every office, someone was likely reporting to the KGB, not necessarily out of malice, but often out of fear. The safest way to survive was to blend in. Religion, once central to Russian life, was another casualty of control. Churches were closed, repurposed into museums or warehouses, and priests were branded as relics of the past. Officially, the state was atheist. Publicly attending church could mean losing your job or being marked as unreliable. Yet, faith didn't die. It simply went underground. Secret baptisms were held in rivers at night, icons were hidden behind walls or under beds, and old women still whispered prayers in kitchens with the curtains drawn. For many, religion became not only an act of devotion, but an act of quiet resistance. The same was true for art. The state had decreed what acceptable art should look like. Socialist realism, a style that glorified workers, leaders, and the promise of communism. Painters, writers, and filmmakers had to show life not as it was, but as the state wanted it to be. A painting of a tired factory worker might be banned if it didn't show him smiling. A story about hunger or despair was seen as anti-Soviet. Creativity had to serve the party, or it had no place at all. But under the surface, another art world existed, one that lived in the shadows. Writers typed forbidden manuscripts called samizdat, illegal self-published works copied by hand or with typewriters using carbon paper. Each copy was passed from one trusted friend to another, often with the warning, "Don't show this to anyone else." These underground works included banned authors like Solzhenitsyn or foreign texts smuggled into the country.
Reading them was risky, but for many it was worth it.
In a world of lies, truth, even dangerous truth, felt sacred. The tension between conformity and conscience was everywhere. Teachers who taught history had to memorize state-approved versions of the past, where defeats were called strategic retreats and failures were temporary challenges. Doctors couldn't admit shortages of medicine, and engineers couldn't acknowledge that projects were failing. To tell the truth was to risk punishment. To lie was to survive. The irony was that everyone knew this, but no one said it aloud. Censorship extended to letters and literature. Foreign books were carefully screened. A single Western novel could be worth a month's wages on the black market. People who managed to get their hands on one, perhaps a copy of 1984 or Dr. Zhivago, treated it like a holy relic, passing it secretly among friends late at night. Ironically, George Orwell's dystopia, meant as a warning about totalitarianism, became a mirror that many Soviet citizens recognized all too well. Entertainment itself was political. Even the most harmless thing, e.g. songs, jokes, or plays, could be dangerous if interpreted incorrectly. One misplaced line in a play could lead to the closure of an entire theater. Musicians who played Western jazz or rock were accused of spreading decadent bourgeois values. Yet, as always, people found ways around it. Illegal radio shows, underground music recordings called magnetizdat, and private performances in apartments kept forbidden culture alive. It was risky, but it made people feel human. Love, too, was shaped by the system. Marriage was encouraged, but intimacy was not always private. Divorce and infidelity could be used as political weapons. A spouse's denunciation could destroy reputations. Even relationships were colored by caution, affection often hidden behind stoicism, tenderness replaced by vigilance. Families stayed close not just for love, but for protection. What's remarkable is not how fearful people became, but how they adapted. Human beings, after all, are endlessly creative under pressure. Soviet citizens built parallel worlds, spaces of trust and laughter that existed quietly behind the state's back. A kitchen, with its smell of borscht and the hiss of a samovar, became more than a place to eat. It was a sanctuary where people could speak freely, share forbidden ideas, and momentarily forget the eyes and ears beyond the walls. Historians later called this kitchen culture, the private heart of a public lie. By the 1960s and 70s, this double life had become second nature. The older generation remembered the terror of Stalin and learned to keep quiet. The younger generation, better educated, more skeptical, learned to question, but carefully. They mocked the system in jokes, but only among friends. These jokes, known as anecdotae, were small acts of rebellion, a way of saying what couldn't be said openly. Everyone knew them, and everyone pretended they didn't. Here's one that made the rounds. Comrade, why is the KGB building so tall? So they can listen in on God. It was funny, but it wasn't harmless. People had been imprisoned for less. Yet humor endured, because laughter was the only safe way to release the pressure of fear. By the time of the Brezhnev era, the Soviet Union looked stable on the outside, proud, unified, and strong. But inside, the cracks were widening. The people had learned to live with control, to hide their true selves so well that even they sometimes forgot who they were. It was a strange, paradoxical kind of existence, outwardly loyal, inwardly free, a nation of masks beneath which a quiet rebellion of thought was always growing. This was the silent legacy of surveillance, not just the fear of being watched, but the lifelong habit of pretending not to be. To live in the Soviet Union was to exist within an intricate choreography. Every move rehearsed, every expression rehearsed, every word weighed before it left your lips. And yet, within this rigid system, millions of people managed to carve out spaces of humanity. It wasn't rebellion in the dramatic sense. It was something quieter, subtler, and perhaps even more powerful. The art of endurance. Let's start with the morning, because in the Soviet world, every day began with a ritual of order. Apartment blocks, grey and uniform, came alive before sunrise. From thousands of windows, the same sounds echoed: the crackle of a radio, the clatter of dishes, the rhythmic voice of the morning announcer reading party-approved news. The radio was more than background noise. It was an ever-present companion, a voice from the state reminding you what to think, what to believe, and what to fear. And yet it was also a kind of clock, a reassurance that you were not alone in your routine. Everyone else was listening too. Inside cramped kitchens, the air smelled of boiled potatoes, cheap tea, and sometimes hope. People started their days with whatever the stores had, maybe black bread, margarine, and jam. Coffee was a luxury. Chicory was the substitute. Meat was rare, and when available, it was celebrated. Housewives queued for hours at state grocery stores, waiting patiently as clerks weighed each gram of sugar or butter with bureaucratic precision. The line, as the ochre became an entire social world. You waited, you chatted, you complained softly, and you listened. Sometimes, rumors spread faster in grocery lines than through official newspapers. Did you hear? A shipment of oranges arrived at the market. My cousin said they'll have real chocolate next week. Someone's nephew got arrested for listening to the BBC. Waiting wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a way of life. In the USSR, everything valuable required patience: food, furniture, even friendship. The scarcity economy created a strange kind of solidarity. People traded favors, shared news, and formed underground networks of barter. A friend who worked at a store might save you a cut of meat. A relative in the countryside might send potatoes. These quiet exchanges built an invisible economy beneath the planned one. The informal Soviet market that kept ordinary life functioning when the official one failed. At work, the atmosphere was just as ritualized. Offices and factories operated under a strict rhythm of quotas, meetings, and slogans. 5-year plan in 4.
Labor is honor.
Glory to the worker. The slogans were painted in bright red, but the mood beneath them was often grey. Productivity targets were rarely realistic, so workers learned the art of pretending, filling reports, adjusting numbers, and staging successes for inspectors. It was a collective performance where everyone knew the truth, yet no one dared to speak it. The result was what sociologists later called the culture of imitation, a society that mimicked progress while quietly managing decline. And yet, within these bureaucratic facades, people found small joys. A factory worker might slip a handmade toy into a child's pocket. A teacher might secretly lend a student a banned poem. A typist might risk retyping a censored book on carbon paper in her apartment late at night. These acts were not grand revolutions. But in a world where the truth itself was forbidden, they were heroic in their own quiet way. Evenings were when people truly lived. After the endless slogans, the queues, and the monotony, home was the one place that felt real. Soviet apartments were tiny, but they were alive with warmth, conversation, and music. The radio might still murmur propaganda, but people would lower the volume and switch to their own soundtrack. Vinyl records of Western jazz smuggled across borders, or cassettes of underground Russian ballads copied again and again until the tape hissed. Someone would pour tea from a dented metal pot, and the evening would unfold in laughter, stories, and sometimes defiance. This was kitchen culture, the secret heart of Soviet life. In those small, smoky kitchens, people said what they truly thought. They debated politics, art, and philosophy in whispers. They joked about party leaders, discussed foreign broadcasts, and recited banned poems from memory. The walls were thin, but trust was thick. And that trust was precious. Because once you invited someone into your kitchen and closed the door, it was an unspoken pact. What was said here stayed here. These gatherings were risky, but they gave life meaning. For many, it was the only space where freedom existed. Fragile, fleeting, but real. In a society built on conformity, the kitchen became the last republic of individuality. Outside those walls, control never slept. Surveillance wasn't just about the KGB. It was about everyone watching everyone. Neighbors reported on each other, co-workers whispered suspicions, and even friends could turn informants. It wasn't always out of cruelty. Sometimes it was self-defense, a way to prove loyalty or protect one's family. A single denunciation, real or fabricated, could destroy lives. He listens to foreign radio. She laughed during the anthem. They said something about Brezhnev. That was enough. But people learned to adapt to even that. They developed a double vision, a way of seeing two worlds at once. The official one, where everything was fine, and the real one, where everything was fragile. They learned to live in both simultaneously, slipping between them with ease. The result was a kind of psychological acrobatics that shaped generations. Entertainment, too, became a quiet battlefield. State television offered endless parades, documentaries about tractor production, and heroic films about the revolution. But what people loved were the comedies. Clever, subversive films that smuggled truth beneath humor. Directors like Eldar Ryazanov mastered this art, creating movies that mocked bureaucracy and hypocrisy while somehow escaping censorship. The audience understood the hidden meanings to every line, every raised eyebrow. Laughter became a form of code. Music followed the same pattern. Officially, the state promoted patriotic songs and orchestral works. Unofficially, people were listening to bard songs, poetic, guitar-driven ballads about loneliness, injustice, and freedom. The most famous of these underground musicians was Vladimir Vysotsky. His voice, rough and raw, carried the emotion of an entire generation. His songs weren't played on state radio, yet everyone knew them. They spread from tape to tape, apartment to apartment, like whispers of truth traveling through the dark. Romance in the Soviet Union was both complicated and tender. There were no dating apps, no grand gestures, but there was sincerity. Couples met through friends, at workplaces, or in those long grocery lines. Love stories bloomed under fluorescent lights and cold winters. A walk in the park, a shared cigarette, a stolen kiss near a metro station. These were moments of genuine connection in a world that demanded conformity. Weddings were often modest affairs, but the photographs always captured something real. Two people, smiling, believing in something beyond the state. Holidays were another paradox. Public celebrations, May Day, Revolution Day, were mandatory displays of unity. Streets filled with red flags, banners, and parades. Speeches blared from loudspeakers. But at home, people celebrated their own way. New Year's Eve, for example, became the most beloved holiday of all. Families gathered around the television to watch The Irony of Fate, a romantic comedy that somehow captured the absurdity of Soviet life. When midnight struck, champagne bottles popped, laughter echoed through the thin walls, and for a few hours, people forgot about shortages, fear, and politics. It was pure, unfiltered joy. The kind of joy that made endurance possible. Even in childhood, this duality was learned early. Children pledged loyalty to Lenin in schools, wore red scarves as young pioneers, and sang songs about socialism. But at home, they heard their parents whisper the truth. They learned that official heroes weren't always heroic, and that silence could be safer than honesty. Some grew up angry,
Others adapted.
but all grew up knowing that survival meant playing along, at least outwardly. The more the state tried to control thought, the more creativity found ways to escape it. Art, humor, and love became the quiet weapons of an entire generation. You couldn't fight the system head-on, but you could endure it, outlast it, and sometimes even outsmart it. By the 1970s, the Soviet Union seemed stable. On the surface, everything worked. Trains ran on time, factories operated, people went to work. But under that surface was exhaustion, a society tired of pretending. The slogans had lost their power, the speeches their meaning. People still clapped, but the clapping had no conviction. It was muscle memory, nothing more. In private, though, something remarkable was happening. The very act of pretending, of learning to separate public life from private thought, had preserved something precious: individuality. Behind the masks, the human spirit was still alive, waiting, and that, perhaps, was the greatest irony of all. A state built to erase individuality ended up sharpening it, forcing people to protect it, hide it, and nurture it in secret. Every whispered joke, every banned poem, every kitchen conversation was proof that even in the most controlled society, freedom finds a way. By the dawn of the 1980s, the Soviet Union was beginning to crack, though few could see it yet. The laughter was sharper, the cynicism deeper, the silences heavier. By the time the 1970s rolled into the 1980s, something intangible had shifted in the Soviet Union. The parades still marched, the red flags still waved, the speeches still echoed through loudspeakers in public squares, but the fire that once powered belief had dimmed. The people no longer looked up at portraits of Lenin or Brezhnev with devotion. They looked with weary acceptance, with the quiet knowledge that the slogans had become empty. But beneath that surface of monotony and obedience, a different world was awakening, a world that existed in whispers, in hidden rooms, in pages passed hand to hand. It began with words, forbidden words. In a society where truth was state property, reading became an act of rebellion. The Soviet government controlled every printing press, every typewriter, every bookshop. But truth, like water, always found a way to leak through the cracks. Banned books, the works of Solzhenitsyn, Pasternak, Nabokov, or Orwell, began to circulate in secret. They were not published officially. They were typed by hand, copied on carbon paper, and passed between trusted friends. This underground literature was called samizdat, self-published, self-distributed, self-risked. Each copy carried the weight of danger. If caught with one, a person could lose their job, be expelled from university, or worse, sent to a labor camp. Yet, people read. They read by candlelight, in attics, in basements, behind locked doors. They memorized entire pages in case the book had to be burned. The act of reading became a quiet declaration of humanity. And the words themselves, raw, unfiltered, honest, reignited something long suppressed. The idea that truth was worth the risk. From literature, the defiance spread to music. Official Soviet radio broadcast patriotic marches and sanitized pop songs, but underground musicians the Bardi and later the rock bands, played a different tune. They wrote about real life, frustration, corruption, love, despair, hope. Their songs weren't about tractors or collective farms. They were about the soul. Vladimir Vysotsky, the gravel-voiced actor and poet, became the voice of a generation. His concerts were banned, his albums never officially released, yet everyone knew his songs. They traveled through the country on bootleg tapes, copied hundreds of times, distorted but alive. Later came the underground rock scene, bands like Kino, Machina Vremeni, and Aquarium. Their music was raw and Western-influenced, filled with energy that the regime could neither understand nor contain. To the authorities, it was dangerous noise. To the youth, it was the sound of freedom. The concerts, held in basements, garages, or secret gatherings, felt like a revolution disguised as rhythm. Art followed the same path. Painters, sculptors, and photographers began to reject socialist realism, the mandatory style that glorified workers and party leaders. Instead, they experimented with abstraction, surrealism, and dark symbolism. They painted not factories, but human faces, not flags, but emotions. Their exhibitions were unofficial, sometimes held in apartments or forests to avoid police raids. In 1974, when a group of artists tried to hold an outdoor show of nonconformist art, bulldozers arrived to destroy it. Yet, the image of those crushed canvases spread like wildfire. Proof that creativity, even when silenced, could never truly be erased. This era also saw the birth of the dissidents, brave individuals who openly challenged the system, demanding justice, truth, and human rights. They wrote essays, sent letters to the West, and formed small circles of intellectual resistance. Among them were scientists, writers, priests, and ordinary citizens who had simply grown tired of lies. Many were arrested, exiled, or confined to psychiatric hospitals. The regime called them traitors. History would call them visionaries. One of the most famous dissidents, Andrei Sakharov, a nuclear physicist who helped create the Soviet hydrogen bomb, turned against the very system he once served. He began speaking out for freedom of speech and human dignity. For his courage, he was silenced and sent into internal exile. But his words continued to circulate, carried by people who believed that even a whisper could change the course of a nation. Every act of defiance, no matter how small, carried immense weight. A student caught with Western music could be expelled. A professor who questioned Marxism could lose his job.
A worker who joked about the government could disappear overnight.
But these risks did not stop the undercurrent of quiet rebellion. In fact, they gave it strength. People found ways to express truth without saying it directly. A painting could hint at despair with a single color. A song could criticize the regime through metaphor. Even jokes, the dark, biting anecdote, became weapons of survival. They pretend to pay us, one popular joke went, and we pretend to work. It was humor born from pain, a way to acknowledge absurdity without collapsing under it. Religion too began to re-emerge from the shadows. For decades, the Soviet government had declared war on faith, closing churches, persecuting priests, and replacing spirituality with ideology. But belief never truly vanished. In villages and cities, secret baptisms, underground masses, and hidden icons kept the old traditions alive. To believe in something higher than the party was, in its own way, a radical act. The youth of the 1970s and 1980s grew up in this dual world, half propaganda, half reality. They recited patriotic oaths in school but went home to listen to forbidden music. They studied Marxism by day and read Kafka by night. They learned early how to wear masks, how to smile at authority and think freely in secret. To them, the Soviet dream felt like an old play that everyone kept performing out of habit. Technology, too, began to loosen the state's grip. Radio signals from the West, the BBC, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, could sometimes be caught on cheap receivers, though the signal was jammed. People would sit in the dark, adjusting the antenna, straining to hear the truth through the static. The sound came in bursts, interrupted by loud electronic whines designed to block it. But still, they listened. They listened to learn about their own country, from strangers across an ocean. As the underground culture flourished, it gave rise to something unexpected: hope.
Hope that the lies couldn't last forever.
Hope that one day the walls of censorship would crack, and in small ways they already were. The regime could not imprison every artist, silence every song, or burn every book. Ideas once released had a strange persistence. They slipped through borders, through memories, through generations. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union appeared powerful from the outside, vast, disciplined, invincible. But inside it was aging. The leaders were old, the economy stagnant, the people tired. The same slogans were repeated year after year, yet fewer and fewer believed them. A phrase became popular among the citizens: they pretend to rule and we pretend to obey. It was a perfect summary of the era. The air was thick with quiet irony. Every worker knew the numbers in reports were fake. Every teacher knew the history books were incomplete. Every citizen knew the speeches on television were lies. But they all played along, not out of fear alone, but out of habit, because pretending had become the only way to live. Yet even as pretense reigned, reality was waiting in the wings. The truth, carried in secret books, in whispered songs, and in private thoughts, was gathering strength. It was invisible, silent, but unstoppable. The quiet heartbeat of change. And in that stillness before collapse, you could feel it. Something was shifting in the Soviet soul. For the first time in decades, people were not just surviving the system. They were beginning to imagine life beyond it. The underground was no longer just a refuge. It was becoming a revolution of the mind. It didn't begin with an explosion. It began with a whisper, a typewriter clicking in a dark apartment, a song played quietly behind closed doors,
A joke shared in a crowded tram.
a question asked in a classroom, each act small, each act dangerous, each act human. And in a country built on control, humanity was the one thing the state could never fully suppress. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union had become a shadow of the revolutionary ideal it once proclaimed. The hammer and sickle still waved proudly above government buildings, but the promise they symbolized had dulled under decades of corruption, fear, and fatigue. The great experiment of communism, which had begun with such fiery conviction, was now sustained only by habit and control. Yet, under the surface, the old machinery was breaking down and the cracks were widening. Ordinary citizens could feel it in their daily lives. The shortages were worse than ever, not just of luxuries, but of basics. The long lines outside stores had become an accepted part of existence. You might stand for hours only to find that the shelves were empty again. Sometimes people didn't even know what they were queuing for. They saw a line, joined it, and hoped whatever was being sold would still be there when it was their turn. In many places, bartering returned. The ruble, once a proud symbol of socialist stability, had lost its value both in economy and in faith. But more devastating than the shortages was the weariness, the psychological exhaustion of living in a world where truth was constantly distorted. People had learned to double think, to smile and nod through absurdity. Yet now, even that old survival mechanism was wearing thin. They were tired of pretending. The endless speeches about progress, the forced celebrations of achievements that never came, all of it began to feel hollow. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, and for the first time in decades, a Soviet leader was young, articulate, and willing to speak openly about the nation's problems. He inherited a country on the brink, burdened by military spending, an unwinnable war in Afghanistan, and a stagnating economy that could no longer compete with the West. The system was creaking, and Gorbachev knew that if something didn't change soon, it might collapse entirely. He introduced perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness. These were not just policies. They were revolutionary ideas in a nation that had built itself on secrecy and control. For the first time, newspapers could discuss government failures. Citizens could speak about history without fear of immediate punishment. The Iron Curtain of silence began to lift, and with it came decades of repressed truth rushing into the open. At first, people didn't believe it. They waited for the inevitable punishment, the sudden knock on the door. But when none came, they started to talk. Really talk. Television debates began to address real issues.
Magazines printed stories about Stalin's purges, about the Gulag, about the millions who had vanished into the system.
It was like someone had opened a window in a room that had been locked for 70 years. The air was cold, shocking, and full of grief. In cities like Moscow and Leningrad, people gathered in public spaces to discuss, to question, to demand. There was anger, confusion, disbelief, but also relief. For the first time, citizens could express what they had always known but never dared to say. The lies that had bound them together for generations were unraveling, but openness came with consequences.
Once people began to speak, they couldn't stop. Nationalism, long suppressed, resurfaced across the vast Soviet empire.
In the Baltic states, in Ukraine, in Georgia and beyond, people began to remember their own histories, stories that had been erased by the Soviet narrative. Movements for independence started to grow, peaceful at first, but swelling with momentum. At the same time, the economy continued to crumble. The factories that once symbolized Soviet power were now outdated and inefficient. Collective farms barely produced enough to feed the population. The black market flourished while official wages stagnated. It was becoming painfully clear that the system could not sustain itself. The Chernobyl disaster in 1986 became a brutal metaphor for the state itself. A system built on secrecy, incompetence and denial. When the nuclear reactor exploded, the government's first instinct was not to protect its people, but to hide the truth. Days passed before the public was warned, and even then the scope of the disaster was minimized. Thousands were exposed to radiation, entire towns poisoned, and the fallout spread far beyond Ukraine. The world saw, and the Soviet people saw too, their government had lied to them once again, and this time the cost was death. Chernobyl shattered the last illusions of safety. In the late 1980s, something remarkable began to happen. People started to take control of their own voices. Activist groups, artists, writers, and students filled the vacuum left by the crumbling ideology. Samizdat was no longer secret. It became mainstream. Books once banned were now printed openly. Films criticized the regime. Songs mourned the lost decades. Even humor changed, no longer a coping mechanism, but a form of rebellion. Street protests became a new kind of theater. Crowds gathered with banners demanding reform, chanting slogans that would have once meant certain arrest. Police still came, but the old fear had lost its bite. The Soviet people had learned something powerful. The state's control depended entirely on their obedience, and they were beginning to withdraw it. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, not in Moscow, but its echo thundered across the entire Eastern Bloc. It was as if a psychological chain had been broken. One by one, the satellite states of the Soviet Union began to break free. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. The dominoes fell faster than anyone expected. Within the USSR itself, the old guard of hardliners looked on in disbelief. The world they had built through fear and iron discipline was dissolving before their eyes. The KGB, once the all-powerful shadow of the state, now found itself uncertain. The old methods of control, intimidation, surveillance, arrests, no longer worked the way they once had.
People were no longer afraid.
Files were being exposed, agents unmasked. The very organization that had built its power on secrecy was now being dragged into the light. By 1990, the Soviet Union was a country divided against itself. Some still believed in the ideals of socialism, but most had stopped believing in the system that claimed to represent them. Empty shops, unpaid wages, and endless bureaucracy had worn down whatever faith remained. The younger generation, raised on rock music and Western movies, dreamed not of revolution but of normal life, jeans, travel, freedom to choose what to read, say, or believe. The old slogans, glory to the workers, long live the party, forward to communism, sounded almost absurd now, relics of another age. The parades continued, but the applause was polite, not passionate. Even the soldiers marching in perfect formation seemed less sure of what they were defending. The spell was breaking. In August 1991, the last gasp of the old order came. Hardline members of the Communist Party and the KGB launched a coup to overthrow Gorbachev, desperate to restore control. Tanks rolled into Moscow once again, just as they had in 1968, in 1956, in 1945. But this time, something was different. The people did not hide. They gathered in the streets, standing in front of the tanks, waving flags, singing songs of freedom. For the first time, the Soviet people were not afraid of their own army. The coup failed. Within months, the red flag over the Kremlin was lowered for the last time. The Soviet Union, that immense, unyielding empire of ideology and control, had ended. But the fall was not a moment of triumph for everyone. Many wept as they watched the familiar symbols disappear. For all its brutality, the Soviet Union had also been their home, their childhood, their identity. Its collapse left a vacuum, emotional, political, and moral. The future was uncertain, and freedom, when it finally arrived, felt both exhilarating and terrifying. For decades, the Soviet government had promised paradise on Earth, but had delivered survival instead. The citizens who had lived under that weight, who had endured the censorship, the shortages, the lies, emerged into the light of a new era, carrying the scars of the old one. The Iron Curtain had fallen, but the habits of silence, suspicion, and endurance would linger for generations. Yet in those final moments of the Soviet age, something extraordinary had happened. The people had reclaimed their voice, not through war, not through conquest, but through truth. The truth they had whispered for 70 years had finally become louder than the propaganda that sought to silence it. It was a strange kind of victory. Quiet, bittersweet, hard won, but a victory nonetheless. The great empire that had spied on every breath of its citizens had been undone by the one thing it could never control, the human spirit. And as the snow fell softly on Red Square that winter of 1991, the streets that had once echoed with parades of power stood silent, not in fear, but in possibility. The silence at last belonged to the people. When the Soviet Union dissolved in December 1991, it didn't vanish with a bang, but with a quiet, bewildering sigh. There was no great revolution, no triumphant celebration, only confusion, uncertainty, and the surreal feeling that history itself had changed overnight. The red flag was lowered from the Kremlin, replaced by the tricolor of the Russian Federation. In that moment, 70 years of ideology, sacrifice, and control were reduced to silence. For millions of people across the former Soviet republics, the morning after felt like waking from a long, disorienting dream. The familiar structures of life, the party, the slogans, the collective promises, were gone. In their place was something new, undefined, and frightening. Freedom. At first, many didn't understand what that meant. The word freedom had been used by the state for so long that it had lost its meaning. Now it returned, raw and uncertain. You could say what you wanted, but who was listening? You could travel where you liked, but few could afford to. The police no longer demanded loyalty to the party, but corruption filled the vacuum where fear once lived. In the early 1990s, the streets of Moscow, Kiev, Tbilisi, and Almaty were filled with the strange energy of a society trying to reinvent itself. Old symbols were torn down, statues of Lenin dismantled or left to crumble in forgotten parks. People opened small kiosks selling whatever they could find: Western chocolates, pirated VHS tapes, cheap clothing, or homemade bread. For the first time in decades, capitalism, the enemy that Soviet citizens had been taught to despise, arrived not as a threat, but as a lifeline. Yet freedom had a price. The state that had once provided jobs, housing, and food, however meager, was gone. Entire industries collapsed. Savings vanished overnight as inflation soared beyond comprehension. The ruble was worth less each day, and people carried wads of cash to buy a loaf of bread. Pensioners who had once been respected as veterans or loyal workers now begged in subways, holding cardboard signs written in trembling hands. Help for bread. The black market that had always existed in the shadows now stepped into the light, transforming into what became known as the wild capitalism of the 1990s. Those with connections, former party officials, KGB men, ambitious young opportunists, seized control of the nation's vast industries. Oil, gas, and metals became the currency of power. A new class of oligarchs emerged almost overnight. Men who drove imported cars, wore Western suits, and spoke the language of profit rather than ideology. Meanwhile, the majority struggled to survive. Factories closed. Hospitals went without supplies. Teachers and scientists, once celebrated as the intellectual heart of the Soviet project, earned less than street vendors. For many, the chaos of freedom felt worse than the predictability of control. And yet, beneath the hardship, something remarkable was happening: the rebirth of individuality. For the first time in living memory, people could create without permission. Musicians sang about pain, loss, and hope. Filmmakers showed the truths that had been buried for decades. Writers explored subjects once forbidden: trauma, faith, identity. Religion, long suppressed, returned to daily life. Churches reopened, and candles burned again in front of icons covered in dust since Stalin's purges. There was also a strange nostalgia, not for communism itself, but for the certainty it provided. The Soviet Union, for all its oppression, had given people a sense of belonging. There were rules, rituals, and collective purpose. Now the future was unpredictable. Some longed for the order they once despised. In markets and back alleys you could find pins with Lenin's face sold as souvenir. Ironic, sentimental, almost mournful, the past had become both a burden and a brand. In the countryside, life changed slowly. Villages that had depended on collective farms were abandoned as the younger generation left for the cities. The old communal rhythms, harvests, work songs, collective gatherings, faded. Those who remained behind tended small gardens, traded with neighbors, and reminisced about a world that, for all its cruelty, had at least been stable. For the older generation, the fall of the Soviet Union was not a liberation, but a loss of identity. They had built their lives on the promise of the state, sacrificed for it, and now it was gone. Many couldn't understand the new values: money, competition, self-interest. They had lived by rules of solidarity and collective sacrifice. Now those rules no longer applied. But for the youth, the first generation to grow up without fear of the KGB, it was a time of wild possibility. Western music flooded the airwaves. Jeans, Coca-Cola, and American movies became symbols of the new world. Students gathered in cafes to debate politics, philosophy, and art. Rock concerts filled stadiums once reserved for political rallies. The grey monotony of Soviet life gave way to chaotic color, neon lights, pop culture, and a sense that anything was possible. Still, the ghosts of the past lingered. The surveillance networks did not vanish overnight. Many of the same officials who had once served the regime adapted easily to the new reality, trading ideology for profit. Files disappeared, rewritten or hidden. Some former KGB officers became businessmen, others politicians. The culture of secrecy, as the habit of knowing what not to say, remained deeply ingrained. In Russia, the early optimism of reform soon gave way to disillusionment. The 1993 constitutional crisis, on when tanks once again fired on the Russian parliament, reminded everyone that power, even in the new age, still came from the barrel of a gun. The fragile democracy seemed always at risk of collapsing into chaos. Across the former republics,
new nations emerged: Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan,
the Baltic states, each grappling with the same question: who are we now? Flags, anthems, and languages changed, but the shared trauma of Soviet rule lingered. In some places, statues of Lenin were replaced with those of national heroes. In others, they stood untouched, covered in snow and memory. The West watched in fascination and sometimes pity, celebrating the victory of democracy, while misunderstanding the depth of the transition. The Cold War had ended, but for those who had lived behind the Iron Curtain, the psychological war had only just begun. The 1990s were a decade of contradictions, of freedom and loss, of hope and despair. Some called it the wild years,
others the stolen years.
But for those who survived them, it was the first time in generations that their lives were truly their own, for better or worse. In tiny apartments across the former empire, old radios still hummed with static. Some tuned into new stations filled with commercials and pop songs. Others stayed with the familiar sound of Soviet-era broadcasts, replaying the past like a comfort blanket. Between the two frequencies, mounted the old and the new, lived a generation caught between worlds. And as the century turned, the children of the Soviet collapse came of age. They had not known the fear of the midnight knock, but they had inherited its echo, a quiet awareness that freedom is fragile, that truth can be twisted, that power always watches. The Soviet Union was gone, but its memory remained like a phantom, not seen, but felt in every corner of the new world it had left behind. The fall of the Soviet Union had promised a new dawn. Freedom of speech, open borders, and democracy had replaced the old slogans of Marx and Lenin. For a moment, it seemed that the ghosts of the KGB had been exorcised forever. The Iron Curtain had lifted, and people breathed as if for the first time in decades. But the habits of a surveillance state do not vanish overnight. They hide, adapt, and wait for the right time to return. By the late 1990s, Russia was a nation on the edge of exhaustion. Crime was rampant, corruption swallowed entire cities, and the chaos of democracy had begun to feel unbearable. In this landscape of disillusionment, a new figure emerged, quiet, disciplined, and shaped by the very institution that had once ruled from the shadows, the KGB. His name was Vladimir Putin. When Putin rose to power in 1999, most people knew little about him. He was soft-spoken, almost anonymous, a man who seemed to appear out of nowhere. But behind his modest smile lay the instincts of a lifelong intelligence officer. For him, order was sacred, and control was security. And so, while the nation celebrated the return of stability, something else quietly began: the reconstruction of a system of observation, but with 21st century precision. The world had entered the digital age, and so had the watchers. In the Soviet era, surveillance had meant informants, hidden microphones, and secret police files stacked in dusty rooms. Now it meant servers, data cables, and algorithms. Russia's new intelligence agencies, successors to the KGB, began to weave digital webs across the nation. Phone calls could be intercepted, emails traced, movements tracked by cell towers and cameras. The same machinery that once spied on citizens through their neighbors now did so through their devices. At first, people didn't notice. They were too busy adjusting to the new world, the internet, cell phones, the glittering illusion of modern life. Social media arrived, offering freedom of expression unlike anything seen before. For the first time, ordinary Russians could share ideas, criticize politicians, and connect with the outside world. But the state, ever patient, learned to listen in the new language of the digital age. The system was called SORM, the System for Operative Investigative Activities. It allowed the security services to monitor internet traffic, phone conversations, and even social media posts in real time. Officially, it was meant to protect against terrorism and crime. Unofficially, it became the digital reincarnation of the KGB's eyes and ears. Every message, every post, every click became a potential thread in a vast, invisible net. As years passed, the machinery of surveillance grew more sophisticated. New laws required internet providers to store user data for years and hand it over upon request. Cameras appeared on street corners equipped with facial recognition. Online platforms were pressured to remove undesirable content. Those who spoke too loudly against the government found themselves investigated, fined, or quietly silenced. It was no longer a world of hidden microphones in hotel walls. It was a world where your own phone listened willingly. The strange thing was how normal it all began to feel. People joked about being watched. Memes spread online, poking fun at Big Brother. But beneath the humor was resignation. An understanding that some things never truly change. The watchers no longer needed to break into your apartment. You invited them in every time you logged on. In schools, new generations learned a version of history carefully polished by the state. The Soviet Union was remembered not as a prison, but as a proud chapter of strength and unity. The darker truths, the purges, the famines, the gulags, faded from textbooks, replaced with tales of victory and sacrifice. Statues of Stalin, once torn down, began to quietly reappear in small towns. His face was sold on mugs and posters. The past, it seemed, was being rewritten again, not with fear, but with nostalgia. The line between old and new blurred further each year. The secret police no longer called themselves KGB, but their methods, loyalty, control, information, remained the same. The internet became the new Red Square, where crowds gathered and voices rose, but where cameras were always watching. Protesters carried phones that could betray their location. Messages disappeared, accounts were suspended, and online movements faded before they could gain momentum. Yet even under this invisible watch, a quiet resistance endured. Independent journalists and activists continued to uncover corruption and tell forbidden stories. Artists created films and songs filled with subtle defiance. Citizens whispered truths in private chats, careful but unbroken. The same human spirit that had endured decades of Soviet control adapted once again, finding cracks in the system's walls. Outside Russia, the echoes of Soviet-style surveillance began to spread. Across the world, governments realized how powerful digital monitoring could be. From Europe to America to China, new systems emerged. Mass data collection, camera grids, predictive policing. The technology that had been born out of Cold War paranoia became a global phenomenon. The Soviet model of control had, in a way, achieved its final victory. It had gone global. Back in Russia, a quiet paradox defined daily life. People watched television that praised the government while scrolling through social media filled with jokes about it. They lived in a world where truth existed in layers. What was said, what was known, and what could not be said aloud. It was not fear that silenced them now, but fatigue. When everything is watched, people stop trying to hide. The modern Russian citizen lives in two realities. One is public, polished, loyal. The other is private, skeptical human. Between these worlds lies a delicate balance, the same balance their grandparents once walked under the Soviet regime. Only now the watchers wear suits instead of uniforms. And the files are stored not in steel cabinets, but in clouds of data. If the Soviet Union taught its citizens anything, it was how to survive under surveillance. That lesson remains. People still gather in kitchens, share quiet conversations, and speak truth with the curtains drawn. Not out of fear, but out of habit. The eyes of the state may have evolved, but so too has the art of being unseen. And somewhere deep in the archives, digital and physical alike, the files continue to grow. Every message, every post, every search query becomes another entry in the story of a society that cannot quite escape its past. The tools have changed. The ideology has changed. But the instinct to watch, to know, to control endures. The Soviet Union may have died in 1991, but in its place rose something subtler and far more powerful, a system that no longer needs walls or guards to keep its people in line. It only needs connection and consent. The watchers no longer demand obedience. They simply ask for your password. History has a strange way of surviving extinction. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, its flag lowered, its leaders vanished, and its ideology declared dead. But what the world didn't realize was that an idea can dissolve in politics yet live on in practice. The art of watching, controlling, and influencing, the invisible mechanics of the Soviet state, survived, not just in Russia, but in the way the modern world came to understand power. When people think of the Soviet Union, they imagine lines for bread, propaganda posters,
and the looming face of Stalin.
But the true heartbeat of that world was surveillance. The belief that safety, loyalty, and unity could only exist through observation. It was a system built on fear, yes, but also on an understanding of human nature. The idea that if people know they're being watched, they'll behave. That seed, planted decades ago, has now taken root in the 21st century, watered not by ideology, but by technology. In today's world, the eyes that watch us are not spies in trench coats. They're cameras on street corners, cookies in browsers, algorithms that learn your habits better than you know yourself. The same logic that once guided the KGB, gather everything, analyze everything, control the narrative, is now used by corporations and governments across the globe. The tools of the Cold War have evolved into the tools of the information age. Consider this. In the Soviet Union, every citizen had a file. Today, every citizen has a data profile, a living record of where you go, what you buy, who you talk to, and what you think about. The state no longer needs to knock on your door. Your smartphone, your smartwatch, your home assistant, they are all doors you've already opened. And unlike the KGB's dusty archives, this new surveillance system is efficient, invisible, and global. But there's something deeply ironic about this shift. The world spent decades condemning the Soviet model of total control, yet in chasing convenience we have built something remarkably similar. Social media tracks moods, facial recognition tracks emotions, and predictive policing monitors neighborhoods. It's no longer ideology that demands your data, it's efficiency, progress, and entertainment. We have become our own informants, willingly feeding the machine the very information the Soviet state used to force from its citizens. In Russia itself, the transformation is even more haunting. The Federal Security Service, the FSB, successor to the KGB, remains a powerful force. They no longer need to interrogate neighbors for whispers of dissent. They read encrypted messages, scan CCTV feeds, and monitor protests before they begin. A tweet can now carry the same weight as a forbidden pamphlet once did. The methods have changed, but the motive, control through observation, remains untouched. Across the globe, echoes of this surveillance philosophy resonate. In China, millions are watched through the social credit system, rewarded for obedience, punished for dissent. In Western nations, governments and companies gather data in the name of security and personalization. The difference is that now we've traded awareness for comfort. People know they're being watched, and most simply shrug. The Soviet Union had built a society that feared the knock on the door at night. The modern world has built one that welcomes the notification ping in the morning. Both deliver the same message. Someone is always watching, yet it's too simple to say that the watchers have won. Humanity adapts as it always has. Just as Soviet citizens learned to speak in codes and trust only those within their kitchen walls, modern citizens are learning to protect their digital selves using encrypted apps, VPNs, and anonymous profiles. Activists, journalists, and ordinary people now play a new kind of cat and mouse game with the invisible eyes that follow them. The battle between freedom and control didn't end with the fall of the Berlin Wall. It merely shifted platforms. The propaganda posters of the past have become targeted ads. The censors have been replaced by algorithms that decide what you see and what you don't. The Gulag has turned into something far quieter. A digital prison built from isolation, misinformation, and dependency. Still, in this world of infinite eyes, there remains one thing the watchers cannot fully capture: intent. They can track your words, your purchases, your steps, but not the quiet rebellion of your thoughts. The same resilience that survived under Stalin's shadow now hides behind encrypted screens and ironic memes. Every time someone questions, resists, or simply refuses to conform, they strike a blow against the oldest system of power humanity knows: the surveillance of the soul. When we look back at the Soviet Union, it's easy to feel distant, to see it as a relic of a crueler time. But perhaps if we listen closely, we might recognize something uncomfortably familiar. A whisper in our phones, a camera in a store ceiling, a recommendation that feels too personal. The tools are new, but the purpose is ancient: to know, to predict, to control. And so the legacy of the Soviet Union is not just one of ideology or empire. It is a lesson that the line between safety and surveillance is dangerously thin, and that once crossed, it's rarely undone. The most effective control doesn't come from fear alone, but from convenience. From the quiet acceptance that privacy is a small price to pay for ease. The watchers of the past needed secret police and files. The watchers of today need only your attention. Every click, every like, every pause on a video becomes a vote in the system that learns who you are and how to shape you. In the end, the Soviet Union may have fallen, but its greatest invention, the perfect observer, survived. It evolved, spread, and merged with technology until it became indistinguishable from progress itself. The empire of control no longer has borders or flags. It lives in the very networks that connect us all, and maybe, just maybe, that's the true legacy of the Soviet state. Not the red flag, not the slogans, not the statues, but the quiet, unblinking certainty that someone somewhere is still watching. The end of the Soviet Union was supposed to be a victory, the triumph of freedom over control, the collapse of a regime that had watched its people into silence. But what if instead of ending, that way of life simply changed its disguise? What if the very mechanisms that once kept citizens in line now exist, not through fear, but through fascination? Because power, as history teaches, never disappears. It only evolves. In the last years of the Soviet regime, many citizens believed that the cameras, the whispers, and the listening devices would all vanish with the fall of communism. They imagined a world where conversations could happen without caution, where letters could be sent without censorship, where one could finally think freely without wondering if someone was taking notes. For a brief moment in the early 1990s, it felt like that dream might come true. The walls came down, the archives opened, and sunlight poured into rooms that had known only darkness. But within that light, a new kind of shadow began to grow. The technology that promised liberation soon offered a different kind of control. The internet connected people in ways unimaginable to the Soviet mind, yet every connection left a trace, a breadcrumb that could be followed, studied, and used. Governments and corporations learned quickly. Power no longer needed chains or prisons. It needed data. And so began a quiet revolution. One that didn't rely on propaganda or purges, but on persuasion. Every online form, every social media post, every GPS ping became a whisper to the new watchers.
They didn't need to force you to talk.
You volunteered your story, one click at a time. In a way, this was the perfection of the Soviet dream. Imagine the secret police of the past looking at the present world, a place where citizens willingly install microphones in their homes, where every message, every photo, every thought is stored somewhere in a cloud they can't see. The watchers of the past would envy this age. They would marvel at how control had become invisible, how comfort had replaced coercion. The tragedy isn't that surveillance exists, it's that most people no longer care. During the Soviet years, people fought for privacy because they knew what it meant to lose it. They whispered in kitchens, spoke in riddles, and passed notes instead of letters. But in the modern world, privacy is surrendered with a tap. The old terror has been replaced with convenience, and in that trade, something precious has been forgotten. Still, history never stays buried for long. You can see echoes of the old Soviet ways in modern Russia. Journalists mysteriously silenced, protests crushed before they begin, opposition voices labeled as enemies of the state. The technology may be smarter, but the intention is the same. The system still believes that safety can be engineered through silence, that order can be maintained through fear. But even in that, there's resistance. Just as the dissidents of the Soviet era smuggled out their ideas through underground presses and coded messages, the dissenters of today find new ways to fight back. Encrypted chats, VPNs, digital activism, these are the samizdat of the modern age. The tools are different, but the courage is the same, and that courage matters because control thrives on hopelessness. The moment people stop believing they can change things, the watchers win. That was true in the Soviet Union, and it's true now. The greatest rebellion isn't in grand revolutions or public protests. It's in refusing to give up your sense of truth. It's in questioning what you see, in thinking for yourself when the world wants you to think collectively. When the Soviet Union spied on its citizens, it didn't just want to know what they did. It wanted to control what they believed. That's the ultimate power. Not to watch someone, but to shape their perception of reality. And while that kind of power may look different today, it's still here, hidden in algorithms, in news feeds, in systems that know what you'll click before you do. The question now isn't whether we're being watched. It's whether we're watching back, because surveillance only works when it's one-sided, when the watchers believe they are invisible, untouchable, unaccountable. But history shows that even the most powerful systems crack under the weight of truth. The Soviet Union fell not because of bombs or battles, but because its people stopped believing the lie. They began to see, and in that seeing they found power, and so the lesson lingers like a ghost across time. The watchers may never sleep, but neither do those who dream of freedom. In every era, from Stalin's midnight arrests to the silent algorithms of the present, there have always been people who refused to let fear define them. Writers who spoke when it was dangerous, artists who painted truth into propaganda, citizens who risked everything to remember what freedom feels like. They remind us that control, no matter how complete it seems, is always temporary, that even in the most watched societies, a spark of defiance endures. And that spark, or whether whispered in a Soviet kitchen or typed on an encrypted phone, is enough to light a fire the watchers can never extinguish. The Soviet Union built a system to erase individuality, but in the end, it proved that individuality cannot be erased. The human spirit, for all its flaws and fears, has one strength that no government, no surveillance, and no machine can fully destroy: the will to be free. As the world moves forward, that truth remains our shield. We can build new technologies, new nations, new forms of power, but the test will always be the same. Do we use them to watch or to understand? To control or to connect? History has already shown what happens when watching becomes a way of ruling. It ends in silence, in paranoia, in collapse. But it has also shown what happens when people reclaim their voices. It ends in truth, and perhaps that's the real legacy of the Soviet Union. Not its empire, not its ideology, but its warning that the price of freedom isn't won once. It must be defended every day in every choice we make about what we share, what we hide, and what we believe, because somewhere, even now, in the glowing light of every screen, the watchers are still there. And so are we, and as long as we remember their story, they'll never truly win.